Hello everyone, this is Matt from Real World Review, and today we're going to replace the back glass on the iPhone 11 Pro Max. So the back glass that we're going to use is going to have the cutouts for the actual camera, so it's not going to be the exact glass, but it's going to fit over the camera lens, so it's going to be easier to replace. Also, we're going to be taking the whole phone apart, so if you're not excited to do that, I do not recommend proceeding. Also, this is a very lengthy process that's going to take you about 3 to 4 hours, if not longer, so proceed with caution. So the tools we're going to need are going to be a PH000 Bit, a P2 driver, Y000 Bit, standoff bit, razor blade, Xacto Knife, a plastic pick, and some heat. You also need some glue, as well as a lot of clamps. So the first thing we're going to do is grab the P2 driver and remove the bottom 2 screws. I highly recommend using a magnetic mat so you can make sure all the screws are in place. Honestly, I would recommend buying that before proceeding with this video. But either way, once you get that done, we're going to heat up the bottom area just a little bit, not really too much. All we want to do is get a blade under the frame of the screen, so then we can lift it up like this, and then we can use a pick to cut through the adhesive. You want to cut through the bottom part, the left part, be careful on the right side, and then finally on the top portion. You want to lift up the screen just a little bit. You don't want to lift the screen off the device because there are cables on the right side. And what we're going to do is we're going to loosen up the screen from the frame and we're going to move it over to the right side like this. Next, we're going to grab the Y000 Bit. We're going to remove these 2 screws right here, as well as that panel. And we're going to unplug the battery. Then we're going to remove these 6 screws as well. We're going to remove this panel. Then we're going to unplug the display cable, the digitizer cable, and the top flex cable. We're going to use that same driver and we're going to remove these screws for the camera right here, as well as all the pieces that go with it, making sure to put those in order. Then we're going to lift this piece up and put it over to the side like this. And then we're going to grab the standoff bit and we're going to remove all those screws right here, these 3. Then we're going to start unplugging all these cables and lift out what we can. For example, we are going to lift out the Face ID mechanism very carefully. And then we can unplug these on the bottom as well. If you haven't done it already, make sure to remove the SIM card tray so then we can lift out the logic board. Pretty much what you want to do is focus on lifting it up on the right side and it should just come out. This is assuming all the cables are out of the way and obviously unplugged. Next, we grab the Y000 Bit, remove these screws right here, as well as this little metal panel, and then we can remove all the screws on the bottom as well, making sure we know exactly where they go. A few screws have the Y000 Bit, and then a few screws have the PH000 Bit, and then these other screws will have standoff bits. Once we remove all those, we can fold the bottom speaker down to loosen up the adhesive and remove it. We can start unplugging these cables and lift out the Taptic engine. Next, we can remove this little metal panel. There's a little hook on the right side, but it should come out fairly easily. Then with the standoff bit, we want to remove these screws. Grab the Y000 Bit, remove these screws. Then we grab the PH000 Bit and carefully remove these bottom 2 screws right here. Then we want to loosen up this microphone area so we can separate it from the device itself. And then carefully lift it up like this. I highly recommend using some heat because if you damage this, it is very expensive and very annoying to try and replace this charging port. But either way, it should lift out like this, and we can set that aside. Next, we're going to remove the battery. We're just going to use these pull tabs to kind of take the battery out. It can be difficult to do, so be very careful. In the end, you can add some heat to kind of loosen up the adhesive, and that's ultimately what I ended up doing. But once you add a decent amount of heat, it should come out fairly easily. Just make sure not to bend the battery. Next, you want to just lift out the camera like this. Just start with the bottom area and kind of pull it up. Should come out fairly easily. Just make sure you're not bending the cables or ripping them out. Next, we grab the Y000 Bit and remove these 3 screws right here, as well as this little metal panel. And then we can remove this screw up here, as well as that little metal piece that sits under it. Then we got these 2 screws right here and that metal panel. And then just remove all the Y000 screws that you can see. And some of them may be PH000 screws. Again, any little piece, grounding piece or whatever it may be, make sure you know exactly how it goes. Also make sure to keep that separate so you can put it back in the phone. Next, we got to remove this cable, so we're going to unscrew the power button, these 2 screws with the PH000 Bit, and move them over. Then we're going to loosen up the microphone very carefully, and it should just kind of come out like that. There is some adhesive, so be very careful. Try not to tear that cable, obviously. Then move it over to the side. And then right here, I didn't really know what I was doing. Pretty much what you want to do is there's actually a screw under this little metal panel All you gotta do is just unscrew that, and then this little metal panel will lift up. It's very easy to do, but for some reason, I didn't notice this. So I just kind of pried on it to remove the camera flash. I don't know what I was doing, but you want to remove that, and you also want to remove this little top piece as well. Next, you want to remove the little piece that the microphone was sitting on, as well as the little metal mesh that you see from the outside. It may be difficult to do, so you can remove that piece after you do the back glass or remove it now, but I chose to remove it right now. Next, you want to carefully remove these antennas, but there are some Y000 screws on the side that you do need to remove first, so make sure to do that, unlike what I did. But once you remove those screws, you want to put a pick under the actual antenna so you can loosen up that adhesive. Feel free to add some heat if you want to. I didn't on this one, but I highly recommend adding heat for a few seconds to kind of loosen up that adhesive to make it easier to remove that piece. And just lift them straight up, don't try and mess with them, and they should just come out fine. Next, we're going to remove the wireless charging. You do want to loosen it up right now. Don't remove it right now. But what we're going to do is we're just going to loosen up that wireless charging panel. Again, you can use heat if you want to and loosen up this cable on the bottom. But pretty much all we're doing is loosening it up so we can remove it. And once we get that loose, we're going to flip it over to the other side, remove this little black panel right here. Then we're going to remove all the PH000 screws that we can see. Then we're going to remove this piece as well, starting with the silent switch, and then the volume button should just come out fairly easily. And now we're done with removing all the parts. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to heat up the back glass and remove it. So what we're going to do is we're going to grab our UV glove or a heat resistant and cut resistant glove like this, the Xacto knife, and definitely some protection for your eyes. So pretty much what we're going to do is we're going to heat up the back glass, and we're just going to get a nice base heat, I guess you can say. And we just want to make sure the whole back glass is pretty warm. Once the back feels warm, what we're going to do is we're going to focus on one area for 5 to 10 seconds, and then we're going to get a razor blade to kind of lift up the back glass like this. The smaller the piece, the better, something you can take off with the razor blade, because once we get a decent amount of area, we're going to use the Xacto knife. And now that we have a decent amount of area, we can use that Xacto knife. And all you want to do is just heat it up and kind of just cut through. There are some holes at the top, so be careful around there. But pretty much what you want to do is just cut through the adhesive. This one is a little bit better because the glass is thicker and the adhesive isn't really as pervasive as something like an iPhone 8. But just remember to add some heat whenever you do get some resistance. And sometimes big pieces of the glass like this can come off really easily. Other times you're going to use the Xacto knife to kind of cut through the adhesive. And pretty much we're going to do this for the whole phone until we get to the camera area. Once we get to the camera area, it gets a little bit difficult. What you're gonna do is you're gonna focus on the camera area when you do break the glass. If you get a glass breaker, I highly recommend using that. I don't recommend the method that I'm doing right now, but if this is all you have, this is all you can do. Just make sure not to bend the metal frame too much, or you could cause damage when you put the phone back together. And now I'm using a hammer to kind of crack the glass, and I'm using a very small bit, so then it does crack the glass. However, I have done this before and it cracked the bit, so be careful with whatever bit you decide to use. But again, I recommend using a glass breaker. And pretty much all you gotta do now is just use some heat, cut through the adhesive, and kind of clean up this area. It is very time consuming and very difficult to do in the middle, but you want to make sure it is flat, and all the glue doesn't have to be 100% perfectly off, but you want to get somewhere around like 85 to 90%. You want to make sure this is really clean, so then there's no lifted areas for the glass to crack in the future. And actually what I do is I go under a microscope so I can see what I'm doing, and it makes it really easy for me to cut through the glue. And pretty much what you want to do is you want to make this little plastic trim on the left side. You want to make sure that still looks fine, but you want to remove all the excess glue that was left on here from the back glass. This may take time, and if you don't have a microscope, this kind of sucks to do, but I highly recommend using a microscope if you have that option. Again, you want to just make sure that everything is nice and neat, there's no extra glass, and if there is some extra glue, it's not detrimental to this repair, but I highly recommend getting rid of it if you have that option. Leaving excess glass or excess glue could cause the back to either crack easier or crack when you're putting on the new glass. But again, the camera area is going to be a pain to do, so that's really going to take up most of your time. Either way, once everything looks good, we're going to straighten out the frame. We're going to make sure everything looks nice. We're going to make sure that all this stuff is clean. There's no dents or anything like that, so then this glass will kind of just sit nicely. And we're going to test the glass to make sure that it does fit on there nicely. And so far it looks like it does. So what we're going to do is we're going to grab the clamps and we're going to grab the glue. And now we can add all the glue on here. I recommend kind of doing this. Now this is kind of overkill, but you want to make sure that there's enough glue on there so then the back touches onto that and it sticks onto that as well. And what you can do is you can use clamps on this right now, and you want to feel the side edges and the corners to make sure that it's fitting on there properly and it's not overlapping on any of the plastic piece. And once you've done that, you can start putting on clamps. It's up to you if you want to do it like this. I recommend putting the screen back on. You just kind of want to be careful and make sure there's no glass on the actual screen frame that could possibly crack the screen. But either way, I recommend putting 5 clamps on each side, maybe 6 or 7 because this is a larger phone, and then 1 or 2 on the bottom and then 1 or 2 on the top. This was when I was starting to do these, so I kind of went overkill on this. But the more clamps you have, the better, but it's not entirely needed. You just need about 5 or 6 on each side. Then the next step we're going to do is let this sit for about 2 to 3 hours, and we're going to remove all the clamps. And we're going to check out how it looks, and if there's any excess glue, don't really worry too much about that. Just make sure that the back glass is sitting down on the phone properly. Now if you didn't add the screen on, then you can just continue, but if you did add the screen back on like I did, carefully remove it. It might be stuck on there again, so use heat if you need to, but what you want to do is make sure that none of the glue got onto the actual flex cables, so carefully lift that up. It looks like it didn't for me, so everything is fine. And what you can do is you can clean up any excess glue that you see on the inside, because that doesn't really help anything. Now we can start putting the phone back together. You can do it however you want, but this is how I'm going to do it. So I'm going to put this little camera flash in there. Yes, I still messed this up. I don't know why I did this, but either way, you can put this little camera flash area back in and then put the little metal clamp and that screw back in as well. Then set the rest of the cable properly, as well as applying the screws in the right areas. Then we have the antenna that needs to be put back in, as well as those screws and panels that sit over that cable. This includes the 3 Y000 screws on the right side. Remember that the left mixes PH000 and Y000 screws. Make sure the connecting piece is facing the right way, while the metal panel makes a backwards L before being screwed in by the Y000 screws. Then you have the Y000 screw with the metal connecting piece that faces up, if that makes sense. Then we can set the power button back in, put those 2 screws back in as well. Then we want to remove this little microphone piece onto the new back glass. This little metal piece is kind of a pain to get it straightened, but then we can use this plastic piece to kind of sit down on there. Then we can fold the microphone back over, put that panel back on, and the screws that go in there as well. Next, we'll put the wireless charging back in place and just put these pieces back in where they go, starting with the volume buttons on the bottom per se, and then the silent rocker is going to go on the top. Then we can put all those screws back in place. Make sure that the volume buttons click and the silent switch works, and once it's working well, we can continue on. So we can kind of set the wireless charging back in place. Obviously it's not going to be perfect, but we can set it back down like this. Then we can start putting in the charging port as well. Set that back in, kind of shove it down to the bottom, and then we can put those bottom two screws back in so we can hold it in place. Next, we're going to put the standoff bits where they go, one going here and the two going into the charging port. And make sure that the microphone area is lined up. We can put this little metal piece back in here, and we can grab these Y000 screws and put them in the right area that they're supposed to go to, setting in the Taptic engine and doing the same thing for these other two screws. Then we can put these two side screws in. Then we can set the bottom speaker back in place, put those PH000 screws in, as well as those standoff screws that go on the left side of that and the right side of the Taptic engine. And then let's plug in the wireless charging cable. Next, you want to put the camera back in place, clean up that area where the camera is. Sometimes dust does get stuck in there, so you want to use either an air compressor or like a Q-tip like I'm doing. And then once everything looks nice, you just set the camera in place, and you should be good. Now we're going to put the battery back in the phone. You want to put these two strips of adhesive right here, as well as one strip on the top area. And then we can set the battery back in place. The nice thing is we can plug in this bottom piece so we can line up the battery properly. And then we want to set the logic board back in place. And it should just kind of fit in like a puzzle piece. And once it fits nicely, we can put in the standoff bits, those three screws. Then we can move on to the Face ID. You want to line it up on the top piece, and then everything should just plug in properly. Because I messed up that little piece, the Face ID does kind of fit in kind of weirdly, but it should be fine for yours. Next, we're going to put the camera cover in. It slots in on the right side, and then we can put in the screws that go in the top and in the middle. Then we're going to put this little metal piece. We're going to make sure all the cables are on the inside, so then the metal piece covers those cables, and then we put those two screws in. Next, we can plug in pretty much every cable that we see, and then we're going to get this little metal piece. We're going to set it above the charging port cable, and then add the three Y000 screws that go into that. Next, you want to make sure everything is plugged in on the bottom and all the screws are back in place. Then we can put this little metal panel back on, as well as the Y000 screws that go into those four pieces. I did forget this little black piece right here, which isn't really detrimental to the repair, but I still like to make everything look nice. So make sure to put that back in place. Obviously, I recommend doing that before you put the battery in, but here we are. Then the next thing we're going to do is I'm going to remove the adhesive around the edges. If you don't have new adhesive, I don't recommend doing this, but also make sure there's no glass or anything like that on that adhesive. So if you see any glass, you definitely want to replace that. Either way, once we put a new one on there, or in this case, I cleaned it up and I made sure it looked nice, you want to grab the screen, put it onto the phone, and then grab that little metal panel, slide it in like this, and put in all 6 of those screws. Now we can finally plug in the battery, put that little metal piece over it, as well as those 2 screws, and we can test the phone out. And for some reason it wasn't powering on. I had to put on a wireless charger to get it to power on. Not sure what's going on with that. And the touch looks like it's working, the power button looks like it's working, so everything should be good. So all we're going to do is just set the screen down, and we're going to grab the P2 driver and put in the bottom 2 screws. And that's pretty much it. Hopefully this video helped you out. If you have any questions, leave them in the comment section or message me on Twitter. I get bored over there. And feel free to follow me on the social media listed above. Subscribe to my channel so you can see more repair videos like this, as well as some review videos, and hit that bell button so then YouTube reminds you when those videos do come out. Thanks for watching.